Hey there, fellow sea glass lovers. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm Jackie, and I have been getting a little bit carried away making little art cards. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I made these ones. These are 5 inches by 7 inches, and they involve quite a few different techniques. So they would be what I would call a multimedia art project. So join me to see what I do to make these. They make lovely little cards because you can write on the back, but then they're also a little piece of art that will remind you of being at the beach. So in my last video, I showed you how I made these flowers using sea glass, and I was really inspired by Queen Anne's lace. So as I look at Queen Anne's lace, I want to make even more Queen Anne's lace. So today I'm using a multimedia approach to make some of my art cards. So what you're going to need for this project, I'm going to demo this project on a purple background. So what I have here, I'm doing it 5 by 7, so I have a 5 by 7 piece of Pellon one-sided stabilizer. I have a piece of purple fabric for my backing. I have a piece of purple batting cut, and the batting and the backing are cut a little bit bigger than 5 by 7. And then I've got a bunch of strips of fabric. Now I'm using all dyed fabric because I like to dye fabric for my fabric art. But you can use whatever fabric you like. So I have cottons here, and for a multimedia approach, I like to use different fibers and all sorts of different materials. So these are cottons, more cotton, but they're all different weights of cotton, so they're a little bit different. I have some silk. I have some lace that's been dyed purple. And I have another weight of silk. This is kind of heavier silk. This is lighter silk. And I have some cheesecloth. And I have some linen. So this is my background, and I've got a piece of tulle. This is like that really light, airy stuff that will go on top. It's cut quite a bit bigger than the rest of the piece. I'll show you how that goes in. And then I've got a tray of purple stuff. Now, if you're like me and you like to craft, you probably have all sorts of different materials. So with a project like this, anything goes. Look through all your crafting materials and just throw anything at it that you want. Because I'm working in color themes, I'm picking out all my purple stuff for this one. You can pick out a whole variety of colors if you want. It doesn't have to be monochromatic like I'm going. So I have purple variegated thread to quilt this with. I have purple solid thread to do my binding around it. I'm going to do some painting. So I've got a couple of small purple paints. These are both metallic because I love stuff with a bit of shimmer, and I want to put some purple shimmer in this. I have some purple beads. I have some purple ribbons. I have some purple sparkles. It's not really like glitter. It's like really thick glitter. And I've got some of these little embellishment things. I get stuff like this at the dollar store. I have some paper for some of my paintings, so I'm incorporating some paper crafting in this. I have some wool rovings. I have embroidery floss and some yarns, more embroidery floss, more fibers, anything you can find that you feel could go in this, you can throw at it, whatever you've got. So I've gone through and picked out a bunch of my purple stuff. I have a purple marker. All of this is going to get used. Now, I want to make 5 of these, so what I've done is I've gathered a bunch of material in this green color, which is like a chartreuse, so I'm going to make 1 in that color wave. I'm going to make 1 in a turquoise color wave, so I've got all the same stuff in turquoise. I've got all the same stuff in more of a darker green, so I have my chartreuse type green and more of a true green with all sorts of paints and all the same sorts of things. And then my fifth one I'm going to make is in orangey rusty colors. This is the type of color that reminds me of the color of the sand and the soil in Prince Edward Island. So I have some browns and golds and rusts and all sorts of colors like that for this. Now the other thing I have here is a tray of materials that contains things I'm going to use in all 5 of my little art cards, because although these are each individual, there's going to be some consistency in them. So in each one I'm going to use some white wool rovings, some white yarn. I've got some gold yarn here to create some grasses. I have some white and gold beads. I have some green thread that I'm going to use for the foreground grasses, some gold thread, and some other white thread. I've got a black marker because I'm going to use that to write some messages on all of them. And I have some glitter glue. I love glitter glue. It creates just a little bit of a sparkle in some of my fabric pieces, so I tend to use it quite a bit. And lastly, I have a jar of sea treasures. So in each card, I'm going to put a hagstone, which is a rock with a hole in it, because that's symbolic of good luck. I'm going to put a pebble that is a caramel colored pebble, because on our beach in PEI we get a lot of those and I just love them. One of these tiny shells, I find quite a few of those at our beach. A red pebble, because red pebbles are very much like PEI. And then some sea glass, a green piece, a brown piece, a white piece, and a blue piece. So I have a jar of these treasures, and each card is going to get this nice little variety of treasures that I will glue on at the very end. So let's get started. So the first thing I do is I want to prepare my background. So I take my background fabric, which is to go on the back of my card, and I take my piece of Pellon Pellon fusible stabilizer. And on the sticky side, I'm going to go to my ironing board. I'm going to press that on. I know you've watched me do this before, so I'm just reminding people who haven't seen me do this before. I'm pressing that on, and then I'm going to trim off the edges. So I'll be right back. So I have my backing all ready. So when you press that on, it sticks, and you can trim around the edges, and now I've got this nice stiff back, and I can take my purple marker or black marker and I can write my name, I can write a note to people. So I have that all done, and I'm going to set that aside until I finish my card. And I've also done my turquoise one, my green one, my orangey rusty one, and my greeny chartreuse one. And these, I really like to use hand-dyed fabric for these because they're so pretty and dynamic, and they're light enough that I can write a note and you can read it. But if you want to use regular fabric, not hand-dyed fabric, commercial fabrics, just be sure to pick a color that's light enough that you can write on it. So those are all going to be set aside until my cards are finished. Now, another thing I want to do is I want to do a little bit of paper stuff that's painted because I want to add some words to this. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take a little tray here and I'm going to do some painting on my paper so that I can write on it. And I want it to be purple. So I have my metallic purple paint here. I've got 2 shades of it. I'm going to use some of this on the top of my finished piece as well. When you use paint on fabric, if you're using any amount of it, you could add a medium, like a paint medium to it, so it doesn't make your fabric really stiff. But for the purposes of this, I'm not going to use enough that it's going to make that big of a difference. So I'm just going to use that on top of my finished piece, just to add a little bit more interest. But for my paper part, I'm just going to do some kind of wispy, sparkly painting here. and then I'm going to leave it to dry until I can do some writing on it, because I want to add that into my final piece. So I have all 5 of my pieces of paper painted, and it's dry, so now I can write on it. So I'm going to write some messages that I'm going to hide inside my cards. And the messages that I want to write, the Queen Anne's lace is symbolic of safety and refuge and kind of a nest where you can have a lot of, you feel kind of cozy and at home. And right now we're at a time when I'm thinking we need a lot of peace and love going on between all the pandemic stuff and the war stuff. It's been a bit of a rough go. And the reason I'm making 5 of these cards is that I'm having the opportunity to get together again with some of my family. We do these family get-togethers, and I'm getting together with 5 of the girls in the family, and so I'm making a card for each of them. So it's sort of as a way to celebrate that we're going to be together again. We have a lot of love going on. We have a lot of laughs. That's a big part of our family get-togethers. So I'm going to write all these messages, then I'm going to cut these into little bits and put it right inside my card. All right, now I'm going to get into some real fun. So I'm going to take a couple of the layers off here. So I have all these layers of fabric laid on top of my piece of batting, and I'm just going to put a bunch of stuff on top here. So I really like having some of this white wool rovings. It's kind of like little bits of cloud in the sky. Some of the really twisty stuff is cool. And I'm going to take some of my ribbon and just do little snippets of purple. This is some bright purple stuff. This is where you can put anything and everything on here. So I've got little specks of purple ribbon. I've got some purple ribbon like this. Just going to put a strip of that in there. You can cut things as big or as small as you like. I've got some purple rovings here. These are wool rovings. Yarns, ribbons, embroidery floss. It all goes. Here's a little bit of purple yarn. Just adds texture to your background. You can make your little snips of things as big or as little as you like. Just keep in mind that you should use stuff you can sew through. So when it gets into little metal bits and bobs, if you want to add some stuff like that, I would sew that on after you do your sewing, or I would sew it on by hand after you've sewed everything by machine, because otherwise you might break your needle. And beads and things like that, that waits until after the sewing's done. This is a really thick, glittery sparkle thing. Got to put some of that on. And then I have these are tiny little embellishments. So I have to sprinkle some of that stuff on. Now you're probably wondering, how do you keep all this in place? Wait and see. You'll think I am totally nuts by the end of this. And then I'm going to take my words that I've written on the piece of paper and cut them up and just kind of hide them underneath here. So you'll be able to read them. They're not really hidden, but they are kind of. You can put little gems in here if you like. Anything at all. I'm kind of tempted to even take some of my glittery paper and cut that up. So here's my messages of peace. and safety and love, all these things that we want to have going on in our lives right now at such difficult times. Gotta have some laughs. And when you put these in here, you can have stuff on top of it too, even if you don't see all the letters in the end. As long as the messages are there, that's a good thing. So this is where having craft tweezers can really help too. You can move some of that stuff around and get it in just the place you want to. I try not to fuss too much with this stage of things. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, how in the world are you going to keep all that stuff from flying everywhere? And this is where I'm going to take my piece of tulle and put it right on top like that. And I'm going to put some of this fabric at the bottom. I'm not going to put underneath the tulle, and it doesn't have all of this other stuff on top of it. But the tulle will hold everything in place for you, plus it's going to give you a bit of a softening of everything that's going on underneath it. Now I'm going to pin this in place, and I'm going to quilt it. So there you go, I've got everything pinned in place, and what I'm going to do is go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to quilt. Free motion quilting, horizontal lines all the way down to where I hit this loose fabric, and then I'm going to do vertical lines coming up because this is going to be like grass at the bottom, and I'm preparing my grass base for my Queen Anne's lace. So I've put my free motion foot on my machine, and I've put my purple variegated thread into my machine, and I'm going to do wavy purple lines starting here from above where the loose fabric is all the way to the top. So there you go, you can see how the tulle on top of all those bits and bobs and everything I put on there holds everything in place really securely, and it sort of gives it a nice smooth background. So now I'm going to do some vertical lines coming up for grasses because I want some purple grasses in this foreground. And it also helps to hold everything in place. So now I've changed my thread in my machine to green, a dark green, and I'm going to use that to make a little bit of green grass, plus I'm going to use it to make the stem for my Queen Anne's lace. So along with some small sprigs of green grass, I'm going to do a few sprigs like this, where it comes up and then I do a little bit of sideways motion thing, so it looks like a bit of a tuft of grass. So I'll do a few like that. I just want to add some interest down here at the bottom of my grassy area. Up here to some very interesting stuff. And then I'm going to do a stem for my Queen Anne's lace. So I'm going to come up and then stop in the middle, and I want to have 7 stems, 7 curved stems going up off here, and then I'm going to use those as a base to create my Queen Anne's lace. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So then it kind of creates a bit of a nest. So there you go. I've added some green grass there and stems for my Queen Anne's lace. So another thing I want to add, I have this gold thread. I want to put some of this on each of my cards because where our Queen Anne's lace grows, we also get a lot of grasses. And some of those grasses look very goldy. There's a word for you, goldy. All right, so I'm going to couch this on by machine. So I've changed my foot on my machine to my couching foot, and I've put gold thread into my machine. So to couch, you set your machine to zigzag. I have it on a normal stitch length, but the width of the couching I have made fairly small because I don't want great big zigzaggy stitches. And then if you turn your fabric as you go up, it helps get that sprig of grass on an angle. Secure it at the top. So there you go. That's all I'm going to do by machine. Now I'm going to trim this to 5 inches by 7 inches, and then I'll get to work on some of my hand work. So now for some hand work. So before I started my hand work, I went ahead and I finished the backgrounds for the rest of my cards. So I have my chartreuse one, my green chartreuse, my blue turquoise, my kind of foresty green color, and my rusty color, my PEI mud color I call it. So I have those 4 all ready to go as well, but I'm going to demo for you on my purple one. So my next step, I showed you how I couched on by machine these gold pieces of grass here. Now I have some other gold yarn that's really textured. It's got all these little bits sticking out from it, and I want to couch some of that on as well, but I want to do that by hand because I don't want to sew down all those little bits that are sticking out. So to couch on by hand, what I do is I just cut a little length of yarn and I'll put it on where I want it to go, and then I just sew it on by hand. I've got a piece of gold thread so you won't see my thread, and I just come up from the back, do a few stitches to hold it in place, and then sew up the length of the piece of grass, and then secure it at the top, and it's all set to go. And that's what I find so interesting about a card like this. It can have so many different layers, and when you make something that's multimedia, using a lot of different techniques, when a person's looking at it, even though it's a small little thing, they have to look quite closely to see all the little details. So the next thing that I want to do is put all the little blossoms on the Queen Anne's lace. So I have this white, really, really thick thread, and to me, little blossoms are French knots. So when I use the white thread, the really thick, shimmery thread, and make a French knot, kind of tight little French knots too, and then put a whole bunch of these around the stems that I sewed with the dark green thread, it's going to read like a Queen Anne's lace. So to make a French knot, I pull the thread through, I wrap it around my needle 3 times, put it back down in the same hole that came up, pull it tight, and then voila, I have a little French knot. So I'm just going to proceed to make a whole bunch of those. So next I want to add some embroidery floss. I have a string of dark purple and a string of light purple, and I want to add some more detail to my grasses. So I'm just going to do some long strips of grass, and it just adds another layer. So with the darker purple embroidery floss, I'm also adding a few French knots. So I just do 3 flips around my needle, right back down in, Just adds a bit more interest to my grassy area. So now for a little bit of beading. I've got a little tray of beads here that I'm going to add on. I've picked out a few gold bugle beads to help draw your eye to the gold that is down here in the grass, so it kind of ties that gold together. And I've got a few bugle beads. These are those little skinny beads. A few purple ones to put in here. And then I've got a couple of shades of purple beads and a couple of white beads. And just a few little beads. It only takes a very few minutes to add beads. It just helps to add a bit of sparkle to your piece. So I just sew those on from the back. Now for a few more finishing touches, I have some glitter glue here. This is like a clear colored glitter glue. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a little bit of this. I'm just going to stick my paintbrush in there, put a little bit of glitter glue on my paintbrush, and I'm going to paint a tiny bit of it onto the cloud-like areas. And this just adds another little bit of sparkle into my tiny little art piece, because I do like a little bit of sparkle. And I'm also going to take a little bit of paint. This is the same paint I used for my paper bits that I added. Some metallic purple, and this is another shade of metallic purple, different brand of paint. And I'm going to use just a bit of this to add a little bit more grass into my grassy area, or a little bit more detail into my grassy area. Clean off my paintbrush, and then I'm using a paintbrush that's really quite fine and it has a sharp edge, so I can just paint in a few little bit more details into my grass. It adds a little bit more grass plus a little bit more glitter, because these are glittery paints. And by having different shades here, even though it's all purple, it's all in the same color wave, I'm just getting more and more depth and detail into my grassy areas. And I may also add a little bit more detail into some of my background areas as well. Just a few little strips of paint. Something that really interests me when somebody looks at some of my art is when they ask me, how did you do that? So here's a typical example. Even somebody that does art like this is probably going to look at this and say, how did you get that effect? Or how did you do that? So it's always good to surprise people. So now you're getting in on some of my secrets. How I do some of the things that I do to get really cool effects. So the paint's dry, and now it's time to sew the front of the card onto the back of the card. So I have my backing that I prepared earlier that's matching in color. And while my paint was drying, I finished off my other 4 cards as well. So I have my green chartreuse card and the matching backing for that. I have my rusty orange card and a matching back for that. I have my more foresty green color and the matching back, and my turquoise blue one and the matching back. So now to get them all sewed together. So before sewing this, I want to line it up so that it's perfectly matched up. I have purple thread in the bobbin, purple thread in the machine, and I've put my walking foot on, and I'm going to do a zigzag stitch, and I'll set this to a maximum stitch width and a minimum stitch length. And I have to pull my thread up from the bottom, and I'm just going to sew around the entire piece with what's called a satin stitch, and that's going to give me a little bit of a border for my card, and it's also going to hold the front to the back. And there you go. I've got my card put together. I've got the binding, and it holds it together and gives it a frame. So now to glue on some beach treasures. So I've got a couple of little pebbles here I want to put on. I have my hagstone, which is a rock with a hole in it for good luck, and my PEI shore pebble. Everyone that's going to be at this get-together I'm going to are family who have a very strong connection to PEI. So having these sea treasures from PEI has some meaning behind it. It's good when you do a little piece of art to do something with meaning. And the blue sea glass tends to be a little rare, so having a piece of blue in there is very special. So some sea treasures. I'm gluing these on with my Quick Seal Kitchen and Bath Adhesive Caulk, my glue that I use for everything. I have found it to be a very useful tool. And a little shell. So last but not least, I'll take my marker. I'm going to use a purple marker, and I will write a note on the back after this has settled, or set rather. And I'll finish my other cards and I'll show you some pictures of them. So I really hope you enjoyed this project, and it gives you an idea of how multimedia can really create an interesting little piece of art, and it makes a lovely little gift. What I really like about the multimedia is that you can add so many different elements, and it gives a lot of texture and interest, and a person has to look at something for quite a while to see all the little bits and all the little detail that's in there. So thanks so much for joining me for this video. I hope you've had as much fun as I have. And until next time, I hope you make it out to the beach, and happy sea glass hunting.